Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Dimitri. I'm working on Kotlin multi-platform, and quite naturally today my talk is about multi-platform. But it won't be your usual multi-platform talk about features and how you write projects with multi-platform. It will be a technical talk about nitty-gritty details and technical interesting curiosities behind the scenes which is happening in Kotlin multi-platform. So I must make a disclaimer that there are a lot of internals ahead. So please don't rely on this talk too much. I have tried my best to make sure that everything I say is correct right now, but it might become outdated in the future. So please refer to actual documentation. This is the only source of truth. And yes, I know that this kind of disclaimer doesn't work. So I will put a special mark, which will mark an explicitly the most internal parts of this talk, like internal parts. Be extra careful when you rely on them. So with that disclaimer in mind, let's start. And on 1.4, with regard to multi-platform, the whole this release is probably the story of one single feature. In 1.3, you were able to have two levels of hierarchy in your multi-platform projects. You have your common code, which shares code across all your targets in your projects. And then you have a platform-specific code, which is able to provide some platform-specific API or have some platform-specific code for a particular platform. In 1.4, we are able to have multiple levels of hierarchy. For example, we might have a native source set which shares code across all native targets, but not across JVM and JS targets. And it makes a perfect sense, because, for example, native targets share a lot of common, like memory management, concurrency model, working with some fundamental native libraries, like POSIX, for example. And if you have logic which relies on this, it's usually convenient to share it across all targets. And before, it wasn't possible. Now it is possible. And in this talk, we're going to see all components and all bits which are boiled down to this one big and nice feature. And also, we are going to see what's going on behind the scenes a little bit, and even learn how to play with those internal parts. So let's get started. And we're going to start with publishing. Suppose you have your multi-platform code, and maybe you want to share it with someone, with your colleagues, with friends, with families, with community. Then you publish it into some remote repo, like a Bintray or Maven probably, or something else. And in 1.3, we do not publish intermediate source sets. We only publish common source set and platform-specific ones. In 1.4, all source sets are published, including intermediate ones. And this is an important change. And to understand why we need it, let's first look at the example. It might be obvious for some of you why we do need intermediate source sets to be published, but let's just make sure that everyone on the same page. So suppose you have your multi-platform project and you have a library on which you want to depend on. Just for the sake of simplicity, let's assume they have the same structure. Then it's quite obvious that your JVM code must depend on JVM part of a library. Obviously not on JS or Linux part of a library, that doesn't make any sense, but also not only on common part. Common part is okay because it's common, but it's not enough. Maybe library has something up in a sleeve for JVM clients, like maybe some API connected with reflection, which is a unique feature of JVM platform. The same goes for JS, Linux, and macOS. And maybe it's not obvious, but the same goes for common code. Well, indeed, when you're writing common code, you want to use some declarations from a library, some API from a library, but only such an API which has been explicitly marked as common by library authors, because otherwise you won't be able to compile this code for all platforms. So now it should be almost obvious why we need intermediate source sets to be published. This is the same story. You have your native shared source set, and the library has one. And when you're writing code in your native shared source set, you want to depend exactly on this source set, not on common. Again, common is okay, but it's not enough. We want to have more specific API, more granular API for our case. So now that we understand why we have to publish intermediate source sets, let's take a Kotlin publishing model. And we will start with a very fundamental idea behind it. Kotlin tries to reuse as much of platform ecosystem as possible. It means that when we compile Kotlin for JVM platform, we use the same format of jars and class files. Not only it allows us not to reinvent the wheel, but also it allows us to reuse all existing platform tooling like linters, checkers, minifiers, obfuscators, and so on and so forth. They work for Kotlin JVM just as good as for JVM in most cases. So mostly the same goes for JS backend. We have a jar file. Yes, jar file isn't exactly a JS format, but inside those jar files, you will find your usual .js files, and you can use them with usual JS tooling. And native is a little bit different. For native, we have invented a new format called klibs, and we will understand why in a few minutes. So let's just keep it for now. But let's look at common. So I have said that in 1.3, we publish common code somehow. So which format we use for publishing common code? Obviously, it cannot be class files, for example, because class files is a JVM-specific format, and this is a common code, which will be compiled to JavaScript, for example. So for that, we use our own format. We still use jar files, but inside those jar files, you will find .kotlin metadata files. Those are unique format of Kotlin, and it's not present on other platforms. So it was quite a bit of theory. So let's get to experiments, to the interesting part. And so here I will show you how you set up a sandbox for playing with published multi-platform library. Just take any multi-platform project, then add a Maven publish plugin, and make sure that group, version, and root project name are set. Then task published to Maven local will appear is task brought by Maven publish plugin. And actually, Kotlin Gradle plugin plays well with Maven publish, so we will set up all necessary defaults for you. So you just have to call this task. And after this, your project will be published into your local Maven repo, which is usually located in your home directory in .m2 folder. So let's look at the example. I have created a very simple multi-platform project with group ID hello MPP, and you can see how I stand in my local Maven repo in group hello MPP. And then my project called mympp-lib, and you see multiple folders. Each of these folders is a Maven artifact. Let's walk over them step by step. So first of all, we have a folder and artifact without any suffix. It's an auxiliary artifact, and we will get to it a little bit later. Instead, let's look at -js artifact. So just as we have learned before, we publish JS part as jar file. Indeed, we see a jar file. And if you unpack it with any jar utility, you will find exactly .js files with your code inside. Almost the same goes for JVM. It's published as jar files, and if you unpack it, you will see class files inside. Again, just as we have learned before, native part is published as klib, and the most interesting part is this artifact called -metadata with the suffix -metadata. It's actually a common artifact, and it contains your published common code. And indeed, it is published as .jar file, and if you unpack this jar file, you will find .kotlin metadata files. Okay, so with class files, you can use any Java decompiler or Java P tool to view the bytecode in a human-readable format. With JS files, you can just open them with text editor. But what about .kotlin metadata files? And well, the most convenient and user-friendly way to pick into Kotlin metadata is to just open them in IDE. And for that, you just create any project and depend on a library which contains Kotlin metadata. For example, on freshly published library, Just make sure that you don't forget Maven local in your build Gradle in repository section. And then let's open an IDE and look at the right-hand side of IDE. There is a tool window called project structure. You usually see all files of your project here. And at the bottom of this tool window, you will find a drop-down menu called external libraries. Here you will find all libraries on which your project depends on. And this includes multi-platform libraries and all their parts. So on the slide, we can see all platform-specific parts like Dash.js, Dash.jvm, Dash.macOS, and also a common part, Dash.metadata. And IDE works well with those artifacts, so you can just browse them as your usual files and folders, and even open files inside like Kotlin metadata files. And if you open any Kotlin metadata file, you will find something like this. Just for the sake of example, I have decided to take a more interesting case and the library and took a Kotlin standard library. Yes, Kotlin standard library is just a multi-platform library. It has its own command part, and this command part is published as jar files with Kotlin metadata. So all API, which is common across all Kotlin standard libraries, like for example Kotlin.string, you will be able to find it in .metadata files. And we will see something like this. So we can guess that Kotlin metadata has almost all information about your declarations. We see all modifiers like final, open, operator. We see all methods like length, compare to, equals, get, hash code. We see all supertypes like comparable and char sequence. The only thing which is missing are bodies. And yes, this is a major limitation of Kotlin metadata. It is not able to carry bodies of your function. And this is one of the reasons why we have invented a new format. And we will talk about it like on the next slide. But before that, let's get back to our question. So we wanted to know, how can we publish an intermediate source sets? And now that we know that common code is published as jar file with Kotlin metadata, so we might guess a very straightforward solution. So why not reuse the same scheme for intermediate source sets? How native is different from common? And actually, yes, we could use the same scheme. But the question is whether we see Kotlin metadata format as a format of future in Kotlin ecosystem. Do we want to see it everywhere in 3 years, in 5 years, in 20 years, and so on and so forth? And the answer is unfortunately no. As we have seen before, Kotlin metadata has major limitations, like it's not able to carry bodies, and it also has some other flaws. So instead, we see an ideal future of Kotlin ecosystem, something like this. Everything is published as klibs, or at least you are able to publish it as klib. So, and actually in 1.4, Kotlin.js compiler already has an experimental mode in which it will publish your Kotlin.js code as klib. Native compiler already does that, and the same mode is in development for JVM backend. And for common code, we also have an experimental explicit opt-in, which will enable compiling your code, your common code, to klibs. So klib is a Kotlin-designed, Kotlin-centric format of publishing your code and sharing your code. It's common denominator across all backends, and it is able to carry multi-platform stuff around. Okay, that was a lot of theory about publication of multi-platform libraries in 1.3 and 1.4. So let's take a look how it works in 1.4 and jump to experiments. To set up the playground for experiments, in 1.4, you would have probably the same configuration as in 1.3, with the small important difference that you have to put this flag in your Gradle.properties file. This is because this mode isn't enabled by default in 1.4, at least 1.4.0 and 1.4.10. And we want to make sure that we got all things right and we won't break and won't have to change something in future, at least something significant. Then the rest is mostly the same. You have your publish to Maven local task, and then you can navigate to your M2 repo just as before and find a published multi-platform library. Let's focus on dash metadata artifact, which is, as we remember, a common artifact. You would expect to see a klib extension here, but in fact it's still a jar file. This is because we have to work with some limitations and restrictions imposed by requirements of compatibility and also requirements of ecosystem we're working with, which is a Maven, JVM, Gradle, and so on and so forth. So it's still jar file, but inside this jar file, you will find unpacked klibs. So it's almost the same as I have said before in ideal future. And here's a very important and very internal part I want to tell you about. So if you will play with this setup, you will probably notice some weird inconsistencies, and I will tell you about why it happens and why the reality is a little bit different from an ideal picture I have shown before. So let's start with basics. So as we remember, all platform-specific source sets, like JVM, JS, Linux, and macOS on this example, are published as platform-specific artifacts, -JS, -JVM, -Linux, and so on and so forth. That's something we know already. Common artifact is published as -metadata artifact. That's something we know as well. But then what about intermediate source sets? And well, you might have expected to see them in common artifact, in -metadata artifact. But actually, there is a very important exception. Let's look at native source set. In fact, this source set is much more native and much more platform specific than common. You expect to see Kotlin standard library here, Kotlin native features like memory management, some diagnostic checks, and so on and so forth. And in that regard, it makes much more sense to publish this source set as part of platform-specific artifact, like -Linux and -macOS in our example. So in fact, when we publish intermediate source sets, if a intermediate source set is compiled for 2 or more backends, like JVM and JS in our example, then it goes into common artifact, in -metadata artifact. And if it is compiled for the one single backend, like native source set here, then it goes into corresponding platform artifacts. It's something very, very internal. And actually, in 1.4.20, we still change and evolve the scheme further. So in 1.4.20, there will be no -metadata artifact, and the contents of -metadata artifact will go into a root artifact without any suffix. So you can see that this mapping is something very, very internal, something we change frequently. And if you somehow, by some reason, depend on this scheme, please go and tell us. We are very curious about your case. Okay, that was probably everything I wanted to tell you about the layout of artifacts in Maven repository. So let's look into artifacts in particular. Let's look into klibs. And as usual, the most convenient and user-friendly way to pick into klibs is to get a start project, declare dependency on a library which contains klibs, and then you open this project in IntelliJ IDEA, and then you will be able to browse klibs just as usual libraries. For the sake of example, I have taken a Kotlin X Coroutines core, which is a Kotlin multi-platform library, and we are looking at a native part of Kotlin Coroutines core for macOS x64. So first of all, klibs is just your usual zip files with a strictly defined layout inside them. So you can take your usual zip utility, decompress klib, compress it back, make sure that you change an extension, and then it most probably will be the same klib, as long as you don't change its inner structure and layout. Inside klib, you will find a folder called default. This is a mechanism reserved for improving compatibility of Kotlin binary artifacts in future. Currently, there is only one folder called default, but maybe later you will be able to find multiple folders here. But all those folders will have the same layout, so we can take a look at default folder. Inside it, you'll find a folder called IR. IR stands for Intermediate Representation. Actually, this is a substitute for Kotlin metadata, but it's more flexible and it's designed with multi-platform in mind. And we can already see one major difference of IR from Kotlin metadata, which is bodies.knb file. Those are actually bodies of our functions, methods, and properties, and everything else. Something which Kotlin metadata wasn't able to carry around. So we can see how IR overcomes one of major disadvantages of Kotlin metadata. If we talk about IR as a format, then it's mostly just like a tree representing the structure of your code. If you are familiar with some theory about compilers and programming languages, then you probably know about abstract syntax tree, and IR is almost an abstract syntax tree, but with much more information and rich format, but roughly you can see it as just an abstract syntax tree. The next folder is link data, and that's a good old Kotlin metadata. And yes, I know I have said that Kotlin metadata isn't suited for Kotlin of the future, so that's why we have invented klibs and IR, which are the formats of the future, but now I say that we put Kotlin metadata in klibs, which is weird. But in fact, Kotlin metadata is perfectly applicable in some cases, and it's very convenient to use Kotlin metadata, for example, in tooling, in IntelliJ IDEA. So currently it stays here. Maybe in future we will migrate our tooling to IR, and then we will be able to drop Kotlin metadata, probably. But maybe we won't do that, because Kotlin metadata is very convenient and it actually improves performance of our tooling, so maybe it will stay here forever. We don't know yet. It's something we have to decide. Then we have a folder called resources, and this is a folder reserved for multi-platform resources. Then we have a folder targets, which is an obsolete folder. Let's not pay attention to this folder. It probably will be gone in the future. And finally, we have a manifest file, which is a text-based, human-readable, key-value manifest for internal purposes of klibs and compiler, just like a manifest in jar files. You can open this manifest with any text editor and read the internals of klibs. Well, not klibs themselves, but flags and how compiler works with them. So that was a lot of information about publishing multi-platform libraries. We have learned about Kotlin metadata. We have learned why it's not good for Kotlin of the future. We have learned about klibs and IR, which are the formats of the future. So I hope you have found something interesting and useful for you in this section. Now, let's continue with the next feature of 1.4, which is a simplified dependency management. In 1.3, you had to declare dependencies on each part of multi-platform library manually, from a common part of your project to a common part of your library, from the JVM part of your project to the JVM part of your library, and so on and so forth. In 1.4, it's enough to declare only one dependency on the whole library, and Kotlin Gradle plugin and Gradle will do the rest for you. And again, before seeing what's going on behind the scenes, let's take a look and understand why we really need this feature, because it might look like a small removal of boilerplate, but in fact, it's much more important. So let's start with a simple case. We remember that we have to dependencies from common part to a common part of a library. So all those dashed lines are lines in your build Gradle files, which you have to write manually and figure out manually. And for this case, it might not seem as a very complex task, like just put a suffix dash JVM and you're fine, and or suffix dash Linux and so on and so forth. But what about more complex cases? Imagine library you want to depend on has a really complicated layout. And I was kind enough to write this diagram for you. But I doubt that each library will have this diagram. So imagine that you have to figure out for yourself. You have to dig into documentation of a library. You have to figure out all those source sets, their names, relations between them, and then you have to figure out on which particular source sets you want to depend on. And then you like, why I am doing programming, I don't want to do that anymore, and it's awful. We don't want you to give up on programming, so we want to make things better. So before just saying that we have a lot of magic together with Gradle and everything works fine, let's take a look at how it happens and try to figure out some intuition about what exactly this automatic magic does. And for that, let's take a look at several examples. First of all, is it okay to source set called JVM to depend on a source set or this library called all except JVM? Well, the answer is obviously no. It literally says all except JVM. JVM is not okay. Well, what about Windows? And now it's much more less obvious question, because it might be appealing to say that this is okay because source set says all except JVM and Windows is not JVM, so it should be fine. But actually, if you look at this library, you will see that it doesn't even compile for Windows. It doesn't provide API for Windows. So actually, this dependency is not okay. And probably just an unfortunate naming. A library also meant all by all targets I'm compiled for, and we have thought that all is all possible targets. And it's pretty unfortunate. Okay, let's continue. What about source set called Linux and GS? And yet again, it's not quite obvious from the first glance, but if you look closely at the library on the right-hand side, you will see that source set called all except JVM actually compiles for Linux and JS, and also for iOS and macOS. And this means that it provides an API for Linux and JS. Therefore, this dependency is okay. And you can see that this process is very, very non-trivial. So we need some mental framework to work with it, so that make it a little bit more easier and not rely on a vague naming, which might be unfortunate. So in 1.4, in Kotlin, we have a notion of platform, like Kotlin multi-platform, we have multiple platforms, and so on and so forth. And actually, platform is not just a single value of enum, like JS, JVM, or native, or common. It's actually a set of those enums. So for our source sets, Linux and JS source set has a platform which is a set of Linux and JS. And it says that this source set compiles for Linux and JS. JVM source set is just a set of JVM, Windows is just a set of Windows, and this source set, all except JVM, with non-obvious name, its platform is a set of macOS, iOS, Linux, and JS. And now it can be used to clearly define rules which dependencies are okay and which are not, because sets form a is-subset of relation. And this relation might induce relation something like is-subplatform of. So because Linux and JS is a subset of macOS, iOS, Linux, and JS, it means that this dependency is okay. And if it's not a subset, like JVM isn't a subset of macOS, iOS, Linux, and JS, then the dependency is not okay. And that's actually a basic fundamental rules which we use in automatic magic going on in our Kotlin Gradle plugin and in Gradle itself when we infer all those dependencies automatically for you. Okay, that was a lot of theory, like some sets, relations, and maths. So let's get back to our experiments. The setup is just the same. Just take any multi-platform library and publish it to your local Maven repo, then browse it. And you remember we have skipped this artifact without any suffix, just my MPP-lib. We have said that this is an auxiliary artifact. And this artifact actually is needed to, it's actually needed for multiple things, but one of the things is to simplify dependency management. Inside this artifact, you will find a file with extension.module. This is a file with so-called Gradle module metadata. You might have heard these words if you're working with Android, for example. And if we look into this file, we will find a large JSON with a lot of words in it. So I have only selected an interesting part, which is called variants. So libraries have variants. What is the variant of a library? Well, it's a part of a library, or maybe a view of a library, some facet of a library. And so multi-platform library actually have multiple variants. It's published as a JS variant for JS clients, as JVM variant for JVM clients, and so on and so forth. But it's still the one and the same library. And all those variants are enumerated here. And they are marked with their platforms. So you can see here that we have a section attributes, and it says that this library has a JVM, it has a JS part. And this JS part is available at this path. And we can see that this path is exactly a JS published part with jar file, with .js files, or klibs in a new mode. So basically, when you declare a dependency, Gradle goes and downloads this file, goes over all variants, and then it's like, oh, you have a JS part in your project. And I see that this library has JS part as well. And I can find this JS part here. So I will download and add to your project for you. That's basically what happens with this automatic dependency management. And it's quite cool. Okay, let's get to the next feature of 1.4, which is using native dependencies. In 1.3, in your native shared source sets, you were not able to use some native libraries, like POSIX, for example. In 1.4, it is now possible. And it's actually might not be obvious. What was the reason behind it? Why we were not able to use POSIX in your native shared code? Because POSIX is present almost on every native target. And actually, the reason is that we want to be sound in multi-platform. And native dependencies are tricky to be sound with. So suppose you have your project with your native shared source set, which shares code across Linux and macOS. On Linux, you actually depend not on just POSIX. You depend on POSIX for Linux, which is a separate instance of POSIX. And in macOS, you depend on POSIX for macOS, which is somehow a little bit different from POSIX on Linux. So in your shared code, you cannot depend on POSIX for Linux or POSIX for macOS, because then you might accidentally use API which is unique for that platform. And then your common code won't compile for the other platform. So instead, you would like to depend on POSIX for macOS and Linux, like a common POSIX between macOS and Linux. And obviously, such a POSIX doesn't exist in the real world. No one has written this library. So we could write this POSIX manually, but actually, it's very, very tricky and most probably engineering infeasible, because we will have to write an exponential number of POSIXes for you. Because between each two platforms, there is some non-trivial intersection. So either we write an exponential number of POSIXes for all possible combinations, or we provide one common POSIX between all of them. But the issue is that this common POSIX is this small. It's almost useless. So we have no other option than consider each case and each set of targets on a case-by-case basis. And well, if it's not feasible to write it manually, then let's write a program which does it for us. And that's what happens in 1.4. We have a POSIX for macOS and have POSIX for Linux. And Kotlin toolchain just transforms them and automatically infers a common API between them. And it provides you with this POSIX for macOS and Linux, which are needed exactly in your case. And well, that's kind of interesting stuff. So let's quickly jump to experiments with it. And to experiment with this technology, which we call commonizer, you have to set this flag and you have to set it exactly to false. And yes, I know it's kind of what, but yes, sorry. I hope we will make it more straightforward in next releases. For now, just bear with us and put this weird string in your settings Gradle together with other weird strings in your settings.gradle. Then you have to create a project with the native shared source set. And on the slide, you can see a very, very small snippet of how you do it. In your project, you're probably gonna do it a little bit more elaborate, but still it gives you a rough idea. And finally, you just either import the project in IntelliJ IDE or run task Gradle.commonizer. Then, if you have set up everything right, you will see something like this. The task run commonizer is launched, and we say that we are preparing an inferring and common API for you. It takes a few minutes because you might guess that it's not a trivial process. And after that, you can just use the IDE. And in our good old familiar external libraries view, you will now see something like this. You will see multiple POSIXes. And you can see something weird here. You might guess that POSIX for iOS ARM64 is a platform-specific POSIX. The same goes for iOS x64. But what about iOS ARM64 and iOS x64 is a common POSIX? But what about those POSIXes with small stars? And actually, that's because Kotlin toolchain doesn't produce only a common POSIX. It produces a common POSIX and accompanying platform-specific parts for that. So this POSIX with star near ARM64 is a ARM64 specific part of a common POSIX. And it might be a little bit hard to wrap your head around this at this point. So let me show you an example. And it should be pretty clear why we have those multiple libraries here. So suppose we have two platforms, platform 1 and platform 2, just for the sake of simplicity. We have a class foo. It has some common method called common and platform-specific methods, platform 1 and platform 2. And we have a property common wow, which is a common property, just the same property on both platforms. So what happens after inferring this common API? Well, obviously, we see a class foo in the common part. It contains only one method, which is a really common method between two platforms. It's an expect class. We use expect actual feature here. And on platform 1, we give an actual implementation, both for common method, and also we add an additional methods specific for that platform. So it's pretty natural. But what about common property? Well, we could declare an expect property and provide an actual implementations on both platforms. But it doesn't make sense because this property is exactly the same on both platforms. So why not just lift it from platforms to the common code? And that's what we do. And now you can see that all those 5 code snippets are different. The code which has been platform-specific for platform 1 is different from platform-specific code for platform 1 after commonization. It has received some additional modifiers like actual, and some declarations has been lifted to common, and also some other stuff changes. So that's why we have this notion of platform-specific POSIX before commonization and platform-specific POSIX after commonization. Oh, okay, that was a lot of information. And it was a quite tightly packed talk, so let's have a quick recap what we have learned today. First of all, in 1.4, we publish intermediate source sets. In 1.3, we haven't done that. And now we know that we needed to make it possible to depend on granular API of a library. In 1.4, we slowly switch from jar with Kotlin metadata to klib with IR. And for common code, it is enabled under explicit opt-in. We have learned about klibs, which is basically a zip file with a strictly defined layout. And Kotlin metadata is a set of serialized Kotlin declarations And so the same goes for IR. So IR is just like a bytecode for Kotlin. And internally, it is represented as a tree of your code. Finally, so not finally, but the next thing we have learned is that Gradle metadata helps us to declare dependencies once. And we even learned how it works behind the scenes. We have learned that we have notion of Kotlin platforms, which are sets, and they has this kind of ISA platform of. They have a notion of compatibility, which helps us to determine which dependencies are okay and which are not. And finally, Kotlin toolchain in 1.4 under explicit opt-in is able to automatically infer a common API between your native libraries so that you are able to use them in your native shared source sets. Wow, that's a lot of information. And with a lot of knowledge comes a lot of power. So I ask you to use this power wisely. Do not depend on it too much. And if you do, please tell us. That's probably the biggest help you can offer us at this point, because multi-platform is still evolving technology, and we do not know all your use cases. So maybe we have missed something, and we have accidentally forced you to use those internals for your use case, because you just have no other option. And if you do, please come to us and tell us about your use case, and we will think about it. And maybe we will find a better solution which won't force you into using internals which are unstable and might change at any minute. And that's it. Thank you for listening to this talk. Hope you enjoyed it. And have a nice Kotlin.